First, to give you a little bit of background on what we do at the Social Security Administration, Office of the Chief Actuary, why do we care about these demographic trends, in particular fertility? So, number one, our objective is really to assess the actuarial status of the trust funds as required by law. So, what is the ability to pay the benefits scheduled in law with the revenues that are coming in? What is the shortfall, if any, over the long range? And when we talk about long range, we're talking about 75 years in the future. And our baseline, this is an important point, our baseline is always current law. So we don't anticipate any future changes in law or policy or court decisions. So really think about where we are right now. Just a big picture, what we do, we have an actuarial model reflecting the entire population, the US population and workforce, both authorized and unauthorized and abroad. Earnings in the economy, we have to take those into consideration. Those covered by Social Security, those taxable by Social Security. And then beyond that, which workers end up becoming insured for benefits and how many actually start receiving those benefits. Once people start their benefits, what are their average benefit levels and how long do they continue receiving those benefits? And finally, last piece in our model is really accumulating the reserves of the program, looking at the income and the outgo to the fund every year, just to figure out when those funds will deplete. So, demographic assumptions, they are really critical in shaping the age distribution for the future. And fertility, birth rates, are really the most critical factor in that age distribution. Quickly, let me go through this. Where do we get our data? We have age-specific central birth rates. That's births during the year to mothers at a given age, divided by the mid-year female population at that age. We get the births from National Center for Health Statistics. We get the resident population from the Census Bureau. And putting that all together, we get total fertility rates. Those are really just the sum of the age-specific central birth rates during the year. So one really critical point is that is for a specific year. It's a period measure, not a cohort measure. And this final bullet is a little bit of a mouthful, but the TFR can be interpreted as the average number of children that would be born to a woman if she were to experience at each age of her life the birth rate observed in or assumed for a specified year, and if she survived the entire childbearing period. Okay, so what do we assume? First, the purple lines here are the historical data for the TFR. A couple of things that jump out really quickly is back in the 50s, early 60s, the baby boom. TFRs were well over 3.5. Dropped down significantly in the 60s down to the early 70s, below 2.0. Jumped up again in the early 90s to about 2007, and then dropped again in the recent recession, and since then. So zooming in a little bit on the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's well understood now that a lot of the decline and then rise back up is due to women delaying their births. As I mentioned, the TFR is a period measure, so if births are low in a year because younger women are delaying births, that will depress the TFR. So you will see it go down, then jump back up. But more recently, it's been going down. And is that really because of the recession, other factors? We're going to talk a lot more about that in the rest of the panel. Okay, this next slide really zooms in a little bit more on the 1980 through 2017 period, and more specifically, what we are projecting for the future. So in the projection period, you can see that middle line, we're going back up to 2.0 children per woman. We get there in about 10 years, which is very quickly, from the very low levels right now. The other two lines you will see in the projection period are what we call our low cost and high cost assumptions. So if there are 2.2 children per woman in the future, that's a really good thing for Social Security. We'll have more workers paying into the program, more taxes coming in. There will be more benefits down the road, but that takes a while to flow in. It just changes the age distribution of the population. Similarly, our high cost assumption is 1.8 for the future. That says if births are lower than they've been historically, that will be worse for the program. Fewer births, fewer people paying in. So the question is, we always have to think 75 years in the future. What is the right level for that TFR going forward? So again, this blue line we are on slide 6 at this point for folks on the phone, is the historical TFR. The orange line shows what our ultimate assumption was in that year's trustees report. So for example, in 2019, our assumed ultimate, which generally is years 11 through 75 of the projection period, was 2.0, whereas the actual TFR for that year was down around 1.74. A couple of things you'll notice on this slide is that in 1988, we dropped our ultimate rate from 2.0 to 1.9, just as fertility rates were starting to go up. And again, in about 2000, where are we? In the 90s, we started bringing them up again, those ultimate rates, as fertility rates were going down. It's a tough thing to do, to figure out where the fertility rate's going to go. We want to be incremental when we think about making changes to the ultimate rate. We don't want to assume that the most recent experience is where it's going to be forever. So you will see that we've been at 2.0 for quite a while now. Okay, slide 7 goes through central birth rates by age groups. This is our projections in the 2019 trustees report. A few things that jump out here. The green line is women 14 to 19. You can see those birth rates historically have been going down quite a bit. That's really a good news story. Women 20 to 24, that's the red line here, they have also been going down quite a bit. Some of that we expect is recession effects. Some of it is women delaying births more. You can see for women in their 30s, birth rates there have either leveled out or continue to rise. So it certainly seems pretty clear from this graph that women are tending to have their children later and later. Even women in their 40s, while the numbers are small, you can see they're increasing. So as I mentioned, the typical way of looking at the total fertility rate is on a period basis. This graph, this is slide 8, instead looks at things on a cohort basis. So looking at women, how many children they have in their lifetime. The purple is all historical data. The bluish in the middle is a mix of historical and projected data. So the further you are to the left, really the more historical data is included there. Moving towards the right, that becomes more and more of our projections. For example, you can see women born in 1981. They're about 38 right now. So really, most of their childbearing is completed. So even sort of right in the middle of that blue section, most of that is really good data. And the thing to notice here is that every cohort completed or mostly completed so far is well above 2.0. So one other thing we like to look at is surveys that ask women, how many children do you expect to have in your lifetime? And I know there's a lot going on in this graph, so let me orient you a little bit. We've got age groups going across the bottom, starting 15 to 19, going out to 40 to 44, and then there's a total on the very end. The different colors are various surveys. These are all the National Survey of Family Growth. The orange is the earliest one we've got, which was 1982. Going out to the most recent is purplish, grayish on the end is 2015 to 17. One thing that jumps out is the orange line for ages 40 to 44. First time I saw that, I said, what is going on there? It's actually, these women are really having their children during the baby boom. So they were 40 to 44 in 1982. They were having a lot of births back then. So that's what that is. The thing to note is that expectations have fluctuated a bit, but generally they're over 2.0 and really in the level of 2.2 to 2.3. And just one other way to look at this, one natural question might be, have women's future expectations been changing over time? One thing I should have mentioned on the last slide, let's go back there for a second. You'll see these white lines in the middle of each one of the bars. That's how many children they've actually had so far. So that's actual data. The additional piece above that is future expectations. So what if we only look at those future expectations? The stuff above those white lines on the previous graph. Obviously varies by age group. Women in their 40s don't expect to have many future children. But the thing to take from this graph is that over time, expectations have been either increasing or staying level. They haven't really been going down. So the natural question then is, how do these expectations compare to reality? Are they a good predictor of actual fertility? So we looked at a couple of things here. This is comparing for women 25 to 29 what the surveys say versus the actual realized births. The yellow line is similar to those surveys we just looked at, the NSFG surveys. The orange line we've got here is an earlier survey from the CPS. They used to ask a similar question. And the blue line is actual data and our projections. So what you can see here is that women do tend to overestimate the number of children they will have, but it's relatively steady. It's at about 0.2, maybe a little bit more than the actual number of children they will have. We did a couple of comparisons. You'll see the numbers at the top. The 0.25 is the average overestimate for women who have already reached age 49, so childbearing is complete. The 0.22 incorporates some data for those women who are in the middle of their childbearing years, so brings in the actual data for them. And then the 0.18 is just versus whatever actual data there is and also including our projections. So you can see that each one of those is around the 0.2 to 0.3 area. Similar analysis for ages 30 to 34, basically the exact same picture, and the average overestimates are again in the 0.2 range here. So bottom line on these is really expectations don't do a great job of predicting the level, but they are consistently a little bit high over time. So they are a good predictor as long as you make that adjustment for the difference. All right, how am I doing on time? Okay, all right, we're going to skip over a couple of these slides. We don't actually do our projections by marital status, but if you want to look at the slides later, we've got some age groups by married only and unmarried, and just the percentage of females currently married. Okay, slide 17. One other thing we like to look at is fertility rates by various countries. A lot of numbers on this slide. One very interesting thing to notice is at the very bottom is the United States. The rightmost column is the difference in the total fertility rate from 2006 to 2016, so the most recent 10 years. The US has dropped by 0.3. That is more than any other country on this list. It is sort of a select list, other than India. Most other countries are really in the 0.1, 0, right around their range. So why are we really dropping so much more than these other countries? I think we will just go over one more slide here. We looked at a bunch of countries and what is the mean age of the mother at her first birth. The black line at the very bottom is the US. Bunch of other comparable countries, mostly OECD, are above. What you can see is that the US mean age is well below these other countries. So if some of what's going on is really women's beginning to delay their births, they've got a lot of room to do that. You can see that based on what's going on in these other countries. And very quickly, one thing we learned about from our technical panel, we had Emilio Parado from the University of Pennsylvania come speak to us, is that women born in other countries who immigrate to the US tend to have very high birth rates in a couple of years after they immigrate. So you can see on this graph that women who have immigrated 2 or 3 years ago, their birth rates are almost double the baseline for other women. So there is certainly some connection between immigration and birth rates. We've been exploring, and we'd love to hear others' thoughts on that as well. Won't show you this one, a lot of lines on here, and I think that will do it for now. Thank you, everybody.
I'll say terrific, everyone. It's exciting to see so many people in the room for a fertility talk. This doesn't happen to me every day. And also, so Jim, thanks for organizing. And I should also thank the other panelists who ceded some of their time so I could talk longer. I think everyone has a lot to say, and so I'm grateful for that time. I'm going to back out, just zoom out just a little bit from what Karen said. And where she led us is actually, I'm going to build on a lot of things she said. And believe it or not, we haven't coordinated in advance, so it's nice that we are going to be in agreement on so many things. This is a picture of the U.S. general fertility rate. That's the number of births divided by the number of women ages 15 to 44. Over the broad sweep of history. In case you can't see that axis, it starts in 1840 and it's going all the way up to the most recent numbers in 2018. And the big thing that really will stand out on this graph, there are a few, but the first is that fertility rates for most of U.S. history have been falling, right? They fall through about the beginning of the 1930s, where they actually stabilize during the Depression, interestingly. And then, and so they increased quite dramatically between 1940 and 1960. This is roughly a 20-year, 50% increase in the general fertility rate. And what most people think about is what I call the wartime wiggle, right? This is people deploying and then returning, and this is what constitutes the baby boom, but it's actually not. That's actually a pretty minor part of the story. The baby boom is a really big deal, and then it ends very abruptly, and fertility rates really hit very close to where they are now, right around 60. Where they've hovered. And so from a historian's perspective, when you look at this part, I'm going to try to use my little laser, down here, that seems fairly minor in the large sweep of things. And you can also see those business cycles cycling around there too. Those also seem like fairly minor fluctuations. So the big picture here is that as the US economy is developing dramatically, fertility rates are actually falling and urbanizing. Now, in the 1940s, when we get to the baby boom, people will say, why did fertility rates go up? Urbanization and rising affluence. Same explanation, separated by 10 years from the decline where people attributed the same thing to the roaring 20s. And then after the fact, well, we're continuing to grow, more women are working. People really don't know what to make of this recent period, and women's empowerment has continued to increase, and we've seen fertility rates really stabilize. So one of the things I'll say to the Social Security Administration and to the others who work on this, it's really hard to know what's going on with fertility, which is one of the reasons I think it's excited me and motivated my research for so long. The other thing I'll say is this is the total fertility rate. which is a synthetic measure, but it takes the general fertility rate and adjusts by different numbers of women in different age groups. So the idea is to try to age adjust these fertility rates. And one of the things you see is it lines up really, really closely to the general fertility rate, and fluctuates a bit more depending on the period. Now let's zoom in on that total fertility rate, which is exactly where Karen ended. And I want to talk a little bit more about how this relates to completed childbearing. And what I've done is put together some numbers from the census, which asks women the number of children they've ever had, excluding miscarriages and stillbirths, up until about 1990. And this is what you see from that. So comparing the total fertility rate here in the dashed line, that's what we've been talking about, and that's plotted on this axis in terms of time, to mother's birth cohort plus 25 years, and then looking at her completed childbearing at the end of her reproductive years, what you'll see, and that's plotted up here on this top part, what you'll see is that those line up very closely in terms of pattern. But you'll also notice, and this is part of the points that Karen was making, is that you miss pretty wildly in different periods, especially periods in flux. So in particular, during the baby boom, when women are speeding up their childbearing, they're having a lot more kids at younger ages, you see the TFR go up really, really dramatically. And also, when it starts declining, you see it decline more rapidly than in fact completed childbearing did, right? Now you can take the June CPS, and I've layered it on here so you can see how well it corresponds to the census, because the census stopped asking in 1990 how completed childbearing is moving. And so for the most recent cohort that turned 45, which is really where we think most childbearing ends, that's my birth year, we had a little bit over 2 children on average per woman. Now, the question is, as we've seen the total fertility rate decline out here, how do we expect completed childbearing to change? So for the cohort of 1983, so they're turning 36 in 2019, their completed childbearing is a little bit lower, and that's really what I want to spend some time talking about. So will completed childbearing fall below 2 in the near future, in the long term? To answer this question, I want to back up again. So there's going to be a lot of gratuitous economic history in this, or maybe not, because I think it's important to understand where we started. When we're looking at the long-term decline in childbearing, I want to talk about how we got there, and then I want to shift over and talk about how women are achieving completed childbearing in the recent era. So what I'm plotting here is the distribution of children born to women who are over age 45, and this is for the birth cohort of 1850. So women who are coming of age right after the Civil War, right? And one of the fascinating things when you stare at this is how are we getting to this level? It's almost a uniform distribution. These childlessness rates up here are really driven by non-marriage, so women who are remaining unmarried, and it just goes out between 1 and 12. It's almost flat. You have a good 8% chance of having almost any number between 1 and 10. Okay, this tells you that there's tremendous uncertainty. So even though those averages are changing, you just couldn't be really sure how many you were going to end up with. So what happens as we move forward, that decline, as we move through to the Depression, is you see women more effectively limiting their childbearing. This is cohort of 1870, cohort of 1890. And so the other thing you see is that childlessness rates are really, really high. Over a third of those women, in part driven by non-marriage and in part driven by married women having no children, they're sort of pushing, the mass is really pushing back. And then we get to what we call the low fertility cohorts. These are women who were born in the first decade of the 20th century, coming of age right around the time of the Great Depression. Now you can see that almost 75% of these women had 2 or fewer children, and almost 2/3 of married women had 2 or fewer children. This is one of the reasons Gary Becker said when he's looking at completed childbearing, look, women could get there. They could get to these low numbers well before the age of contraceptive technology and legal abortion. They did just fine. Okay, 30% of these women were also childless. Now let's look at the baby boom. One of the things you see as you push out from those low fertility cohorts is mass is shifting and every part of the distribution out. Women are having more and more children. Childlessness rates plummet, and women are having over 3 children on average over their reproductive lifetimes. But as the baby boom ends, and this is the first cohort sort of where childbearing is starting to really kind of decline, so they're coming of age in the mid-1960s, they would have had access to modern contraceptive technology for their entire reproductive lifetimes and legal abortion for about half of it. And you see the cohorts of 1950 and 1960 loading on there, and you'll see that there's a very different trend emerging. In particular, there's this peak at 2, right? And for these cohorts of 1950 and 1960, we do see this increase in childlessness relative to the cohort of 1940. So just to compare, for the low fertility cohorts, the one that Becker says, hey, they got there just fine, without all of these modern technologies, one of the things you see is that their average completed childbearing was about 2.2, but, and that's only a little bit higher than the women of 1960. But what I want you to take away from this figure is that they got there in very, very different ways. People were making very extreme decisions to opt out of childbearing entirely, not being able to achieve the number you think that they want. Now, coming back to our figures, what do we think, how much has changed, say, for the cohort of 1960, moving through the next 20 years? And this is another graph that once I saw this, I just thought it was so remarkable. So we start with a cohort of 1960 to 1964, and we move forward to the cohort of 1965 to 1969. If you're staring and squinting, you might be able to see a little bit of daylight between those two distributions, but there's really not much. What about the cohort of 1970 to 1974? For that group, you see childlessness rates falling a bit, and you also may see a little bit of mass, more mass in the 4s and 5s, but not much. What about the cohort for women born in the late 1970s? That one you really can't even see. I'm going to toggle back and forth. It's really right on top of it. And in fact, you might see even a little bit more mass out in the 4s and 5s, childlessness rates, really low. So a couple of things. So these are the cohorts that were mostly finished before the Great Recession. So what do we think about the more recent cohorts? In particular, cohorts born in, say, right around 1980, because they're the most recent ones we can really start making projections on. So women born in 1980, they did contribute to, and this is what we're talking about in terms of the age-specific rates Karen put up there. These are age-specific fertility rates for 15-year-olds, they're at the bottom, 20 to 24-year-olds, they're right here, and the 25 to 29-year-olds are right up here, and these are taken from the NCHS vital statistics. And so for women who were born in 1980, they were the ones right here in the early 2000s contributing to a decline in birth rates for that group, and they were also the ones contributing to the decline here in birth rates for 25 to 29-year-olds. So how did childbearing for this group turn out? Say by their early 30s. So I'm back to my picture I was showing you before, where the last cohort is women born right up through the end of the 1970s. And women born between 1980 to 84 who were only 35 and over look remarkably like the cohorts we've seen before. We do see about a 5 percentage point gap between their childlessness rates, which appear higher than the women who were just completed their childbearing at age 45, and about a 2-point gap at number 2. The good news is there's lots of time for them to make this up because they're quite young. And the other thing is we've seen these birth rates for women who are in their 30s. This is 30 to 34, this top line, and this is 35 to 39, rise dramatically. In fact, birth rates for 30 to 34-year-olds have almost doubled in the past 20 years, and rates for 35 to 39-year-olds have more than doubled. Another picture that's quite striking is if you look at birth rates for women who are 40 to 44, that's this top line, it is almost tripled in the last 30 years. And the other thing I'll note, this is where historical perspective is interesting, in case we think we've reached some sort of biological constraint on what's possible, it's in fact still lower. We could actually quadruple and still be a little bit below baby boom levels. So there's still some space to go, presuming there hasn't been a massive biological shift in what's possible. And you also see here that rates of childbearing for 45 to 54-year-olds, and this is mostly for women in their late 40s, could double and still be right below baby boom levels. So if you look at the June CPS, almost 20% of women in the cohorts that have completed their childbearing had had their last birth after age 35, and about 5 to 7% of the same cohorts after age of 39. So bottom line, there's plenty of time for the cohorts of 1980s to make up on the births that they deferred, if they choose to. Just in case you want to see how these have contributed, these changes in distributions have contributed to children born by age and cohort, what I'm plotting here is the mean children born by birth cohort, that's birth year here, and these are averaged by 5-year bins, or I'd say 5 to 3 year bins, just because they start to get really noisy looking at the June CPS. But if you look at the mean childbearing for women who are at the age of 37 to 38, you see that that's creeping up as we move towards the early 80s cohorts. But you'll see that once you account for changes for these earlier cohorts we can measure at ages 40 to 49, these rates are even higher. In fact, we've exceeded 2, but barely, for the most recent cohort. And if you project this out for the cohorts born in the early 80s, just based on what we've seen for the past, in the past decade, we would also expect these to continue to increase. The same thing is true for childlessness. Here again, I'm plotting childlessness at ages 37 to 38 by cohort, and these are exactly the same birth cohorts as I just showed you on the previous slide. And what we see is in the last 20 years, we've fallen from about 20% childlessness rates at age 37 to 38 to around 18%. But if we incorporate information for childbearing after age 38, we see that rates have fallen from just over 19% to 15%. And again, if we use recent experience to project that out, we expect those numbers to fall below 15% for the most recent cohort. Okay, so bottom line here. When you're thinking about the evolution of childbearing in the long sweep of time, there have been some really big fundamental changes. There's a strong adherence now to what is a 2-child norm. You see that peak everywhere in the data, and that could shift, but it really hasn't changed much in the last 30 years. You see slight reductions in childlessness, which is, I think, at odds with most conventional wisdom, where people think that it's actually been increasing. In both of these trends, there's small but detectable increases in children ever born. The other thing is that for the most recent cohorts, falling birth rates appear to have reflected delay in childbearing, not foregone childbearing altogether. And the thing to keep in mind, too, is on top of these rates we've just been looking at, today women have more access than ever to information, medical reproductive technology, suggesting that birth rates at later ages may continue to increase. So should we expect a reversal? So the 1980s cohorts, they're kind of only the beginning of that decline in birth rates for the more recent period. So maybe that not much really happened for them. This is going to be the topic of Kasey's talk, but I want to say just a little bit about what we can learn from history. So arguably, and you might say the only major reversal in childbearing in U.S. history has happened during the baby boom. That was the big thing. So what can we learn from that? And there are a few things I'll say. To anyone who's worked on this, I started in my career and I spent years looking for the correlates. It has to be related to something. So why one day did everyone just wake up and decide they were going to have more kids? This seems remarkable, right? Of course there's something that's correlated with that. We have to be able to understand this phenomenon. But I will say the baby boom, in my view, is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. And so I'll encourage you all to work on that. It happened with very little warning. And I think as an economist, and this is what Gary Becker says, and a lot of other economists have said, it's really easy. It's just a big demand shift, right? So great. But what caused that demand shift? Why did everything just turn around so quickly? A few things about the baby boom that are important, and I think important to contrast from the current period. The decline in birth rates and children born were reversed, and it reversed very, very quickly. Birth rates for all age groups increased and at the same time. So that's different than today, right? Because we have birth rates falling for some groups and increasing for others. So they increased at the same time. Marriage rates skyrocketed because back in those days, people had children within marriage. And the people who were having children, these cohorts, they used the tools that were available to have more children. They started sooner, they got married sooner, and they ended later. Now, the explanations, there's a number of these in the literature. If you're fascinated now by the baby boom, I encourage you to look at them. There's a number of things people have said. Affluence, the introduction of sulfa drugs, the work glut for older women that basically depressed wages and precluded young women from entering so that they stayed home and had a lot of babies. There's a lot of really interesting explanations out there. But the existing explanations, in my view, are incomplete because anything that can generate the massive increase of the baby boom fails to predict its decline because there's not really something that turns on for 20 years in the US economy or health system that then turns off in 1960, right? And that's kind of the problem, is you kind of need something that's going to help you with both. So there's a lot of work to be done on. There's a lot of things, too, that are very different from today. And when we see declining childbearing before the baby boom, we're talking about things that are very different. So today we're talking about the emergence of a two-child norm, low and falling rates of childlessness, marriage and partnership rates, contrary to popular opinion once you account for cohabitation, are at all-time highs. And there's a fading correlation of marriage to the start of childbearing. It's not completely irrelevant, especially for more educated women, but it's just not very predictive anymore. People are having children in and outside of marriage. As they like. And women today had financial and legal access to modern contraception and abortion until recently, where this is changing a bit, and that's something that Caitlin Myers is going to talk a little bit more about. So if you're interested in some of these trends and thinking about them more, a lot of what I'm showing you here is from a paper that I did with two co-authors, Melanie Gouldy and Brad Hirschbein, Is There a Case for a Second Demographic Transition?, where we argue that, in fact, we think there is. Now, for demographers, these are fighting words, right? That's like introducing another paradigm, another model of the world. But we think there's a lot of trends that suggest we're actually working in a very new equilibrium today, in part because so many of these things have changed. The last thing I want to talk to you about, though, is a feature that is not part of what we've been talking about so far, but it's something that I think is really important to keep in mind. And for me, maybe one of the most important parts of what I refer to as the second demographic transition, and that is its relationship to inequality. It's really hard to think about inequality over time by metrics like, say, education, because having a college degree at the beginning of the 20th century and having a college degree today are very, very different things, and very different women select into those groups. So what we do to make these big comparisons over time is we use education quartile. So essentially, we're looking at the lowest 25% of women. So I'm sorry, women with the lowest 25% of women's education group, and then the top 25%. This is nice because we know it's well measured even for non-working women, which also changes dramatically over the 20th century. It's a fairly stable marker, though we know that there's some creep in the censuses for the same cohorts across time. It's correlated with mother's own background, and it also determines her mate, who she ends up marrying, and also her lifetime income. It's comparable across broad periods of history. So when we compare outcomes of women in the top education quartile to the lowest quartile, how do these figures change? So, and again, this is really gratuitous history. We go back to 1820 here, and I put this up because it took us a really long time to put together, and I'm very excited about these numbers. These have never been seen in a public forum before. So, so mean children ever born by age 44, you can take this all the way back to 1820 and pull it all the way up to the most recent cohorts. This line here in the middle, this is the mean over all women. And what you see is in contrast to the declines in the general fertility rate, and I will say some of those declines are based on population projections that turned out to need some revision with the introduction of more censuses. But when you look at the mean children ever born and you do a variety of things to adjust for mortality and things like that, what you really see is this starts to drop in the post-bellum period, right, with American industrialization. That's a really important and, I think, shift from what we thought was the case. The other thing you see is that here's what I showed you before. It maps very well to the overall trends in the general fertility rates, and it fluctuates much less than the total fertility rate, for instance. Now, what you see for the least educated women is that they've always tended to have more children on average, And then this tracks really, really neatly. And the number of children they have for the low fertility cohorts drops from almost 3 to right above 2 in the more recent period. What you see for the most educated women, and Jim, this is for you because you were trying to project out how many grandchildren will I have? So for all of you with children with college degrees, your kids are right here. So you see that the rates are also falling pretty much in lockstep, and that more educated women have always had fewer children than the average. It increases dramatically during the baby boom and falls off almost back to where they were, but not quite. So they're having slightly more as the baby boom ends. But the interesting trend here is that the numbers are increasing. They're about at 1.8 now. So if you think that the behavior of the affluent is a leading indicator of what's going to happen for others, so Princess Diana had 2 children, Kate Middleton had 3, and we're talking about 4 type of situation. Chelsea Clinton just welcomed her 3rd, right? This might be an indication that fertility rates, especially among more affluent women, will continue to rise. We also see some really interesting and I think corresponding trends in childlessness by education. So again, I'm plotting the mean here, right in the middle. And these are the women in the most educated quartile, and these are women in the least educated quartile. So childlessness rates tend to be lower for the least educated quartile. We see everything maps pretty well to the baby boom, and we see that these groups of women were very, very different in the past, where more educated women were significantly less, more likely to be childless than less educated women. And after the baby boom, we see that skyrocket, at least for the first several cohorts, for a decade or so. But starting with the cohorts of 1960 and moving forward, rates of childlessness for the most educated have also plummeted. So, Jim, this is also good news for you if you haven't had a grandchild yet. It's increasingly likely you will. One of the things that I think makes a lot of people, when people are thinking about how many grandchildren will I have, is that there have been tremendous changes in the age at first birth. And often you see these rates in vital statistics looking at the average age at which a woman at a point in time had a child, right? That's what comes out of the NCHS. This is different. This is a cohort-based measure. So here we're looking at women at the end of their reproductive lives, looking to see when they had their first child on average. And this is the mean. And I think this corresponds very closely to the figure. It looks, we're hugging, a 24.5 for the low fertility cohorts of about 1910. We fall during the baby boom to a little bit below 23, and we rise back up. But that doesn't look particularly interesting. It looks like we're right back on our historical trend more recently and kind of leveling off. But what that mean really misses is the tremendous change and tremendous differences in this change by the more educated and the less educated women. Unremarkably, I think more educated women, and a lot of the women I know in this room, maybe a lot of the people you know, have delayed, right? So you see the mean age at first birth really, really rising going forward, and it starts to get really, really noisy when you start to look at modern small surveys, but the trend here is consistent, so I wouldn't take as much away from those fluctuations as sort of the broad trend up. But really remarkable is when you look at what happened to the least educated women. Here, for the birth cohort of 1930, these are the baby boom cohorts, everything was low. But after the baby boom, we see almost no recovery, if any recovery at all, right? It might even be falling more recently, but that's probably just noise. I'd just go for a flat trend. So what's fascinating is that in the last 20, 30 years, as the most educated women have dramatically increased the age at first birth, the least educated mothers appear not to have. And increasingly more of those children are born in a non-marital relationship, right? So this is really fascinating. So one of the things, so the good way to look at some of the more recent trends in delay, or sort of decreased fertility rates, especially for young, less educated women, is that perhaps they're changing and maybe starting to change their behavior to be a little bit more like that we've seen for the most educated mothers, though that's complete speculation. So what do these things mean for the future of U.S. childbearing? one of the things we've seen is a tremendous changes in the composition of mothers, and I will also say composition that have big implications for the living circumstances of children. So for the most educated women, we're seeing increasing delay, age of first birth is rising, age of last birth is rising, they're less likely to be childless, and they're more likely to be in a stable partnership, typically married. This means that they have two incomes, and it also, those children will have two incomes, and it also means that those children are being born much closer to the peak earnings years, right, for women who are older and further along than children born to the most educated women, say, 50 years ago. So even relative to other educated women, children of educated women today are on much stronger economic footing, have many more resources at home. Now, for the less educated mother, you see that age of first birth seems kind of stable, so that's not really pushing up. They're more likely to be childless than in the past, and they're also more likely to be in changing partnerships, whether non-marital partnerships or marriage and divorce. This means incomes are much less certain, so the combination of those forces mean that those children are going to be significantly worse off when they're growing up financially than women in the more educated class, and that gulf is really rising. So one of the things that I think we may be talking about in 20 years at the Social Security Administration meetings that we're not talking about today is that without policy interventions, I would predict increasing disparities in the productivity of workers coming from these two different groups. So thanks a lot. I'll end there. If you're interested in some of my work and some of the places I'm drawing these statistics, you can check out my website, and also the paper I'm drawing on most heavily is an NBER working paper 19599. Thanks very much.
All right, well, thanks to all of you for being here, and to Jim for organizing this panel, and for the other panelists. We've already had some really great conversations just putting this together that I've been happy to be a part of. And thanks to Martha, I think she set up my talk really well here. So while she gave us a 200-year look in some cases at U.S. fertility, I'm really going to be drilling down on what's been happening over these last 10 years, which as we've seen, are really shaping up to be a fascinating period in U.S. fertility. And I want to do that to try to understand what we think might happen going forward, and what that means for the SSA's projections. So we've seen this picture now a few times. This is that total fertility rate number. Here, I'm just limiting it more to this period that I'm interested in, of 1990 to 2018. And really, especially these last 10 or 11 years, as I've said. If you look 1990 through, say, 2007, total fertility rate was really bouncing around kind of between 2 and 2.1 until we reached a peak at a TFR of 2.12 in 2007. But that's the year at which we began this really remarkable decline, to the point where we now have the lowest total fertility rate in U.S. history at 1.73, and that's an 18% decline since 2007. So in just 11 years, an 18% fall in that measure. Now, I think to really understand this, you have to scratch below the surface of these aggregate trends and really try to understand what's happening for different groups in a way that Martha and Karen have already done a little bit. So I'm going to switch to talking about the general fertility rate, or the birth rate. Martha also showed us that using both of these measures, you basically get the same story. So that's true here as well. So in 2018, we had a historic low birth rate of 59 children per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44, and that's a 15% decline in that measure from 2007. All right, but so let's start to now break this apart, and I'm going to do that first here by age. And it's not a coincidence that Karen showed you a similar picture with birth rates by 5-year age cohorts. I think of this as really the Rosetta Stone for trying to understand what's going on with long-term fertility trends, looking at what's happening for specific age groups, right? So let's start with teen women. We've already seen that they were on a decline. Teen fertility reached a local peak in 1991 in the U.S., but really declined through the 1990s and early 2000s. But we then reached kind of a plateau here. There we go. Reached a little bit of a plateau here in the early 2000s, so that some of us who study teen fertility, the fertility of young women, thought that we might have leveled off or even started to see an increase. But then in 2007, it starts to fall dramatically again, to the point where we have seen a 58% decline in teen fertility in 11 years. That is just astonishing that it has fallen that far in such a short amount of time. Let's move up to the next age group, which is women 20 to 24. So here we also were seeing a decline. I so badly want to walk over there. If you've seen me present before, you know I'm usually running around like crazy. Jim tells me I have to stay put, so I'll use the laser pointer. But we see from 20 to 24, this has been a high fertility group, declining a bit over this period. But again, I'm drawing this line here at 2007. They really start a precipitous decline so that we get fertility rates that are 36% lower in 2018 than they were in 2007 for that group. Women 25 to 29 have had the highest fertility over most of this period here, quite flat from 1990 through 2007, but they too started to decline in 2007, so that their fertility rates are now 20% lower, such that they are now no longer the most fertile group. That title actually belongs to women aged 30 to 34, which I also find really astonishing, all right? So this group now has higher fertility than the 25 to 29. They have not experienced, these women over 30, have not experienced this decline since 2007, all right? It's been actually quite flat for the 30 to 34, maybe a little bit of decline in the recent years, increases for 35 to 39 and 40 to 44. So hopefully you've gotten this sense at this point in our panel that the fertility decline that we're making so much of in the press and that we've seen, we're paying so much attention to, is absolutely a story of young women, fertility falling for women under 30. It's staying flat or even increasing for women over 30. All right, so if you want to start to project, even maybe a little further than what Martha was doing in her talk, the big questions are we going to see those low rates for young women persist, and could we see them fall even further? And then, are these births delayed or births foregone? And of course, that one is really the multi-billion-dollar question from the perspective of the Social Security Administration. All right. So to do this now, I want to look at a picture that's similar to some of the ones that Martha was making. We're again shifting to a cohort measure of fertility. She was constructing hers using the June CPS fertility supplements. Here, I'm using the birth certificate data. So I'm collapsing all of the years of the birth certificate data, calculating the number of births to women born in different years, and then dividing by the size of the cohort at age 15, taken from the census, right? So what we see here, right, in the bottom line, this is the total number of kids had before age 20, and then we go up to before age 25, 30, 35, 40, and 45. So, Martha, I think, did a really nice job of talking about what has happened for these cohorts here and getting up close to those born in the early 1980s. So let me look at those early 1980s cohorts. The last group for which we can see their fertility by age 35 are the women born in 1983, right? So if we look at those women, they are having fewer children than women born even just a few years ahead of them, say in 1976. And by age 35, they're having fewer than 2 kids still at 1.88, right? So they do have some ground to make up to get to a TFR of 2, which is a both historically relevant number and a number that reflects the SSA's projections. But as Martha said, they have some time to make that up with fertility post age 35, right? I want to push beyond, though, kind of where Martha stopped and talk about the cohorts the post 83 cohorts. So take women born in 1988, right? Now we're really getting into the millennial cohort. We can only see these women through to age 30, right? But if we do that, their fertility is really strikingly low, I think, even compared to cohorts just 10 or even, 7 or 8 years ahead of them. So they're looking at by age 30, 1.2 children per woman. Now, they're only 30, so they have time to make up, but they kind of need to get on it, and they're going to have to do it at quite high levels. So if you think of, as Martha said, those baby boom levels of fertility post age 30 as being kind of what's possible, they're going to have to be quite close to that, actually. And, so while that might represent something like a biological frontier, and maybe you would think that biologically, given advances in reproductive technology, they could do even better. Of course, labor force participation of women aged 30 to 34 is 30 percentage points lower than it was for women in 1957, right? So I personally think that for at least these most recent cohorts, it's going to be quite difficult for them to have the levels of fertility post age 30 that they're going to need to catch up to that 2.0 mark, right? So for these very specific mid to late 80s birth cohorts, my estimation is that completed fertility will be a little bit lower. Now, I've done this talk here, and several of these slides, I've drawn a line at 2007, and in a room full of economists, I'm sure you're all screaming in your heads, Great Recession, Great Recession. Normally when we draw that line at 2007, that's why we're doing it. And if you think about these cohorts who were born in the mid to late 1980s, they are coming of age, graduating right in the worst of the Great Recession. And we know very well that graduating college, being young during a time of a severe economic downturn can have long-lasting scarring effects on the labor market. There is good evidence that that's also true for fertility. So this paper by Janet Curry and Hans Schwant, they look at the unemployment rate that women face in their young years, say age 20 to 24. They show that for each 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate that you face at that young age, we expect about 14 fewer kids in terms of completed fertility per 1,000 women, right? These women who graduated college in 2008 to 2012 faced about a 5 percentage point higher unemployment rate than is typical. So I think that suggests that we would, of course, expect for them to have a lower fertility, or at least that's a good reason why we would expect them to have lower, even completed fertility. All right. So that's talking about that very specific Great Recession affected cohort. I think if you want to try to look even beyond that, we can try to learn from these cohorts, though, about what the factors are that are contributing to the very low fertility rates of young women, right? So there are many, many explanations that would fall into this camp, and in my 15 minutes here, I don't have time to touch on most of them. I'm just going to do a couple. One, though, that I want to mention is changes in marriage. So, I think a lot of people will look at a talk like this and say, well, marriage rates are falling, age at marriage is declining, and so that's why we're seeing declines in fertility and increases in the age at first birth. To me, I really see those as two sides of the same coin. It's hard for me to think of something that would have dramatically affected marriage rates but not fertility, so that then, that change affected marriage, which then affected fertility. So, the explanations I'm thinking of, I think of them as affecting family formation generally, right? So the two I'm going to talk about are economic factors and access to contraception. So we've already started with the economy a little bit with these very specific Great Recession cohorts, right? But if we think sort of bigger picture, if you look back at our my total fertility rate picture, we've continued to fall every year. We're getting, 2016, 2017, 18, a 2% decline in fertility even now, right? So of course we would have expected a decline coming out of the Great Recession, or as my paper with Dan Hungerman and Steve Lugauer suggests, a decline in fertility even before the Great Recession, where we look at fertility as a leading economic indicator. We should have seen a recovery in fertility by now if the main explanation was the business cycle effect that's happening there, right? We are not seeing that at all. So this is something we refer to in our paper as a babyless recovery. But if we think about this recovery that we're experiencing, the economic recovery, right, we know that the recovery has not been fully felt by all parts of the income distribution. So I'm going to show you some pictures here now where I'm switching to the CPS because unfortunately we don't have income information in the birth certificate data. But if we just look at, this is average household income by income quartile for women of childbearing age, right? So first, just to show you that there has not been, the recovery has not been the same for all parts of the income distribution. So here, this is women in the top quartile of their household income, And they did experience a decrease in real income right after the Great Recession, but started to recover around 2011, so that they are now at or above the levels that they were before the Great Recession began. For these other groups, though, it's been more flat, and there has not been complete recovery. So I'm going to switch here. This is the same picture, but just so we can see it a little bit better, changing the y-axis to look at the low quartiles here. You know, for the lowest income quartile, we're getting the decline a little bit later when they reach their trough here, maybe 2013, 2014, and still not quite fully at the level that they were before, right? If I use these exact same data to talk about what's happening for fertility for these cohorts by income, fertility for these income quartiles, right? All of the groups saw a decline in fertility post-Great Recession, but for the top three, at least the top two, maybe the top three quartiles, we're seeing that it's flattened out or maybe started to tick up a bit. But for the bottom quartile, we're continuing to see a decline in a decline in their fertility, even as the recovery is fully underway. Now, I was talking with Caitlin just before, and so she had actually looked at the fertility expectations. So, we've seen that the expectations are actually quite stable, but she said that she had noticed in the latest NSFG that for low-income young women, she is seeing a decline in their fertility expectations as well, right? So, I put this figure together really thinking about what's happening with the Great Recession, but I think one of the biggest things that jumped out to me is that we just have this long-term convergence in these income groups in their fertility, and that's similar to what Martha was showing us with education, where you have the lower income groups now having fertility that's more similar to those of the high income groups. All right, so in terms of these economic factors, I think this, the fact that the lower income groups are not fully enjoying an economic recovery could be contributing to the long lag that we experience here. That may also just be part of this longer trend. I want to mention a couple of other issues that are related to the economic recovery or economic issues. We have seen a strong recovery of the housing market as well. This paper by Lisa Detling, I'm forgetting her name, and Melissa Carney shows that actually high housing prices suppress fertility of people who are potentially first-time home buyers, which makes a lot of sense. So if you're in the market and you want to start a home and buy a place where you can put a couple of kids, it actually doesn't work in your favor when housing prices start to go back up. So that's kind of working against increasing fertility rates. And then there's some early work looking at the role of student loans, which is something we've seen a lot of conversation about in the popular press, but not as much work on. So the second thing I said I wanted to mention was contraception. 2A here on the contraception front is better access. And some work that I have with Lucy Schmidt, who's here, and Melanie Gouldy, really points to contraception possibly playing a role, because this decline in births that we're seeing, if you think about it happening for young women, for unmarried women, women in low-income groups, those are groups that have historically been more likely to have unintended births. And in fact, in this paper that we have, we're showing that there's been a decline in the proportion of births that are unintended since about 2009. So that suggests a potential role for contraception. It is not, however, I want to say, driven by abortions. The abortion rate has also been falling over this period. So it's moving in the wrong direction to explain this fertility decline. But how might we have achieved, or why might we have seen better access to contraception in this period? If some of you were looking at those pictures and screaming Great Recession, probably another half of you were looking at those pictures and screaming Affordable Care Act, which is happening over the same period. All right? Now, the timing of this is not exactly right, so we're seeing this decline in 2007, and Affordable Care Act, its first provisions don't come in until 2010, right? But I kind of think of this as maybe a 1-2 punch. So we have the Great Recession that lowers fertility rates as we would normally expect, and just when we might start to come out of it, we get this expanded access to contraception, right? Really importantly, since we're talking about young women, in 2010 we have the young adult provision that allows for women to be on the insurance of their parents, and there's already a couple of really nice papers that show that that did indeed lead to decreases in fertility for women under 26. But then later we have access coming to other groups through the private insurance mandate and the Medicaid expansion. So Lucy and Melanie and I are now working on trying to understand the role of the Medicaid expansions. The 2010 papers here talk about the use of LARCs, and I know this is something that Caitlin's going to talk about a little bit more. But we now also have much higher rates of use of these long-acting, so 5 years or more in the case of IUDs, very effective rates of contraception. So this is from Martha's Oxford Handbook chapter with Jason Lindo showing rates of LARC usage. So, you know, as recently as these 2006 to 2010 NSFG, you're getting about 5% of contracepting women age 15 to 24 using LARCs. That's now tripled. I did the calculation for 2018, we're at 18%. So a shift toward this more longer acting effective method, I think really could contribute to keeping these fertility rates for young women really low. And I'll mention that this is not just the Affordable Care Act, but there's been a real shift in the way doctors think about IUDs. So it used to be that they would recommend them only for older women, married women who had already had a child. In 2009, there was an opinion that came out and said this is an effective method for all women and we should be using it accordingly, right? So to sum up here, what could we expect for the next 10 years or even beyond? As I've said, I think we have a small cohort that came of age in the Great Recession where my expectation is that they will not quite reach 2 as their total fertility rate. But we have this long-term fertility trend toward the lower fertility of the young women and also of low-income women, and the potential that we've reached some sort of a tipping point in the use of LARCs. So those things, I think, are reasons to believe that you know, we might not quite see 2 or much beyond 2 going forward. Of course, if Martha's talk taught us one thing, it's that big things can come along and disrupt this and cause really giant swings. So I think I'll leave it to Caitlin to talk about abortion as one of those. So I'll just transition to you right now. I think that's a good place to stop. All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Myers. I'm at Middlebury College. I pretty much agree with everything that has just been said. In particular, fertility rates are falling quite dramatically if you have a short-term perspective, not so dramatically if you have Martha's long-term historical perspective. And that fall is driven in very large part by reductions in births to women aged 15 to 24. In fact, when I was looking at that country comparison and seeing that the U.S. fall was so much greater than other countries, the other difference between the U.S. and most of those countries is our teen birth rate at base was much, much higher. And our teen birth rate is plummeting and driving a lot of these changes. So I also agree with Kasey that whether this trend will continue depends on the underlying cause. And so I'm going to, rather than showing you the same trends and agreeing with everything, I'm going to talk about a little bit of evidence on what that cause might be in terms of just mechanical causes of pregnancy. Going to be a little bit of sex ed here. I took sex ed in the rural deep south in an abstinence-only class, so get ready. I've learned some sense. So I'm going to talk about some of those mechanical causes, and I'm also going to have an eye to those potential disruptors. It's really hard. We don't know what caused the baby boom or ended it necessarily. It's really hard to think then that we might know at this point whether we're about to have the same type of really dramatic shift or not, or whether this is just a relatively modest delay in fertility and not much is about to happen. It's hard to know. But since I'm going last, I figure I get to throw out some wild theories about potential disruptors, things you might look for that might be going on that nobody's mentioned yet. And also I'm going to talk about the potential for a future change in abortion policy to be another disruptor. I just said all that. Okay, so I think it's really useful to organize our thoughts and by thinking about a fertility decision tree. I will tell you that every time, so economists love fertility decision trees. What's that? We didn't have our mature audiences. Oh, no. Oh, yeah. Get ready. So I stole this from Phil Levine, so credit to him. But economists really like fertility decision trees. They help us organize our thinking about what produces pregnancy and births. Anytime I present fertility decision trees and talk about rational decisions at various nodes of them, non-economists laugh, like sometimes uproariously, and it like disrupts the whole talk. But let's think in particular about the choice of whether to have sex, the choice of whether to use birth control and what, although it's not on here, what method to use and how consistently to use it. And then conditional on realization of pregnancy, the choice of whether or not to have an abortion. These are the nodes that have to just mechanically, somewhere in here, drive what we're seeing with fertility. It's not about a deep underlying cause yet necessarily, but just something has to be happening to these. It's not abortion. I agree with Kasey. Abortion rates are falling. They're falling roughly proportionally to declines in unintended pregnancies. Abortion isn't the story right now. I will talk about whether it could be in the future. So it's got to be sex and contraception. Don't worry if you can't read this. You don't need to read this. It's just an illustrative prop. So I want to think about the risk of pregnancy. And to do that, I'm going to use a kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation that's popular in the public health field. I'm going to take the National Survey of Family Growth. I am going to look at sexual behavior reported by people there. Have they ever had sex? Have they had sex in the last 3 months? And what was the type of contraceptive method that they chose the last time they had sex? And for each one of those, I'm going to assign a probability of pregnancy. The only one of which I am very, very sure about is that if you have not had sex, you have a 0 risk of pregnancy. For the rest of these, they're based on estimates that are also coming from the NSFG. And if people use multiple methods, although this just shows the first method that they report, and it's the most effective method, it's ordered by efficacy. If they use multiple methods, though, I'll actually multiply their failure rates by each other. So if they're using condoms and diaphragms, I will multiply those failure rates by each other and look at what's happening to the risk of pregnancy by age cohort. So here are trends in the predicted risk of pregnancy by age group. And what I think is really interesting about this is for 15 to 19-year-olds, you see the fall, right? You see the fall in the risk of pregnancy. And if you do some back-of-the-envelope calculations, that fall's just the right magnitude to explain what's going on with their birth outcomes, subtract abortions. And similarly, for older groups, you actually see some increase for 35 to 44-year-olds, which is consistent with the view that women are delaying fertility and they're increasingly likely to be trying to get pregnant. But what I find a little bit perplexing is that when I look at those 20 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds, the 25 to 34-year-olds are pretty flat. The 20 to 24-year-olds, these are fairly noisy. I'd like to have confidence bands, actually, but they might be increasing again. Now, how do we reconcile that with the huge increase in LARC use? This is the same graph that Kasey showed you that comes from Martha's work, except for I've broken the teenagers apart from the 20 to 24-year-olds. But we're all in agreement that conditional on using contraception, LARC use is going way up. But the other thing you want to know is that for older age cohorts, they are primarily substituting away from vasectomies and tubal ligation and toward LARC. And so that's not driving what's happening. They're just substituting between very effective methods. What you see for younger cohorts, although the scale makes it hard to see, is LARC use really is going up for 15 to 19-year-olds, substituting from less effective methods, could be driving what's happening. Not as much for 20 to 24-year-olds. All right, so basically for teens, we see the mechanical cause. They're having less unprotected sex. For older groups of women, I'm not so sure, like maybe not, maybe there's something else at work there. And so I think an interesting question is there potentially something else going on at those nodes of the fertility decision tree? I'm wondering in particular about a couple of potential options. One, are people having less sex? So if you read this Atlantic cover story, that's what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it's great. They're talking about the potential for a sex recession. I would tell you there's a lot of conjecture and not as much evidence as one might wish for. So I'm throwing this out there as, could this potentially be a factor in what we're seeing right now? The NSFG that has fairly aggregate measures of sexual behavior, if you had sex in the last 3 months, if you had sex in the last 4 weeks. But the GSS has some measures that let other people, I haven't done this, this is Jean Twenge's work, but back out and estimate annual frequency of sex. And in other people's work, her work, they've estimated that it's declined over a fairly short period of time between 2000 to 2004 and 2010 to 2014 for young people aged 18 to 29 from 87 times per year to 79 times per year, which is like roughly a monthish less sex. if there's really a sex recession, that could be a part of the factor that's going on here in the fertility decision tree. The other thing that could be happening is that women could be using contraceptive methods more consistently. Now, LARC methods and sterilization are virtually error-proof. But if women are taking the pill more consistently, it's also possible that what we're seeing is a decrease in the typical use failure rates for some methods, and that's what's going on that I'm not picking up in my calculations. But the other wild conjecture that I'll throw out there, that might not be that wild, but let's talk disruptors. Could there be something else going on? It's possible that fecundity is declining. And so we don't have, I guess other people don't have, I've never attempted to use this data, there do not appear to be great consistent measures of sperm counts and motility over really long periods of time that contribute to male fertility. But there are some recent meta-analyses that try to correct for all the different methods that they were using in these studies to count and look at sperm. And overall, there's an increasing consensus that basically sperm counts and sperm quality is on a pretty steep decline in Western countries. And that's not going to have a continuous effect on fertility. It's really one of those threshold effects. And so I can't find good evidence yet, I don't know if it can be created, on how many people are crossing, how many men might be crossing a fecundity threshold. But I would mention that this is another reason that the probabilities of pregnancy potentially are changing, as long as we're throwing out new and different ideas. I think that's one thing to keep an eye on. All right, so those are different ideas about what might have happened recently, in addition to the things that have been mentioned. Oh, and let me say one more thing, sorry, before I move on about this sex recession. Looking at that graph Kasey put up with the 2007 line, of course we all thought Great Recession, of course we all thought the ACA is coming, but you should also think iPhone. Right? The iPhone was introduced in 2007, and this is, to my knowledge at this point, anecdotal conjecture, but one of the things people are talking about with this sex recession is that everybody's on their phone and not having sex. It is true if you look at measures of teen risky sexual behavior, or if you just have a teen. I've got 4 kids in my house, tweens to teens, and you know, they don't make them like they used to. Like, they want to stay home and be on their phone. They're Snapchatting all the time. I keep trying to take it away from them. They're pretty obsessed with social media. And like, my husband and I recently had a conversation about whether or not we needed to force them to go out and go to a party. Like, it's possible that the iPhone is another disruptor. Of course, it's possible it's a whole lot of other things too around this time. All right. So it definitely isn't likely that abortion has played a substantial role in what's been happening recently. But I'd like to also consider the question of whether we should keep an eye on abortion policy as a potential future disruptor. Could it matter? Here are some reasons to think it might. As we all know as economists, intentions don't always match behavior. And if you look at survey evidence on what people say they intend and compare it to behavior, when it comes to sex, this is particularly true. So in one recent survey by the National Campaign, 88% of unmarried women aged 15 to 29 said it was really important to avoid pregnancy in their lives right now. But among those who are at risk of unintended pregnancy, 19% were using no contraception at all, 24% were using contraception inconsistently, and 17% freely admitted it was quite likely they'd have unprotected sex in the next 3 months. Not surprisingly, even with the decline in unintended pregnancies that Kasey's documenting, which is driving a lot of the decline in fertility, it's still the case that a little under half of pregnancies, roughly, are unintended. It's also the case that about a fifth of pregnancies right now, about a fifth, it's falling, but about a fifth are aborted. And if you think of, in the same way that one might think of a total fertility rate, if you think of a total abortion rate as the number of abortions that you might see women obtain in their reproductive lifetimes at current rates, you'd expect that about a quarter of US women would obtain an abortion in their reproductive lifetime. It's worth thinking about abortion just because it's so common, and it is a major mechanism that women use to prevent unwanted and severely mistimed births. And just to give you a sense of the scale, here's the total fertility rate. We've seen this a lot, but I added a pink line. So what I did was just take the age-specific abortion rate and use it to calculate a total abortion rate and add it to the total fertility rate. Over the years that I've got measures of abortion, reported abortions being surveilled by the CDC and the Guttmacher Institute, I don't have illegal abortions, which certainly have happened in the past and are self-induced and unobserved abortions and are happening now. But what you see here, just to give you a sense of it, is that abortion could play a really major role in total fertility. It has that potential. It's not my counterfactual. I'm not saying they would all be births. I'm just saying there's enough of them that abortion is potentially salient. Similarly, this is the age-specific fertility rates for 1960, 1970, and 1980. You see the well-documented decline as women are delaying births. But I go and add abortions to the 1980 fertility rate, and you see that it can easily explain the gap, more than explain the fall between 1970 and 1980. Abortion has that potential. Of course, this is not causal evidence, but there's a fair amount of causal evidence out there that abortion policy was a major causal factor in what was happening in the early 70s. Ted Joyce and co-authors estimate that it explained about 82% of the decline in births between 1969 and 1972. I've estimated that it explained about 80% of the decline in first births before age 19. Okay, it's mattered before. It's not driving current trends, but could it matter again? If you're paying any attention to the news, there's a whole lot happening right now in the area of abortion policy. A lot of states have passed abortion bans and near total bans that are not currently being enforced. People are discussing the possibility that one of these new policies is one that could go to the Supreme Court. And so I'm going to just, as a hypothetical exercise, not a prediction of the future, but as a hypothetical exercise, try to get a handle on how much this might matter. Could this be a disruptor? And the way I'm going to do it is to use a paper that two papers that I just published with co-authors, Jason Lindo and Scott Cunningham and Andrea Schlosser for one of them, Rachel Jones and Ushmu Bahade for the other one. And basically, the approach is to look at right now where are all of the abortion facilities in the United States. We have them geocoded. Right now, which states in the United States, if Roe were overturned, are likely to ban abortion? Because if Roe were overturned, this would really be a return to states for policymaking. Nothing much would happen in Massachusetts or Vermont. A lot would happen in Georgia, West Virginia, Louisiana, and Texas, other states where I've lived. So what we do is we have those states that we identify that are likely to ban abortion, and we artificially close the facilities in there. We hypothetically close them. And then we use estimates that we have of the causal effects of travel distance to abortion facilities on abortion rates, and basically back out where and how, by what magnitude we expect abortion rates to change across the country. And so if you look at this map, the counties that are pretty much white, it's not projecting great, these are regions of the country where we don't predict a change in abortion rates due to travel distance, because travel distance wouldn't change. But if you look at the counties that are shaded, the ones that are the darkest red are counties where we predict a more than 40% decline in abortions because they have substantial shocks to travel distance. They're places that have facilities right now that would likely close. And then, as a back of the envelope calculation to get a handle on magnitudes of things, would overturning Roe be the opposite side of the Roe coin in 1973, or the repeal coin in 1970? What we do is basically estimate nationwide what would happen to the abortion rate and do it by age. So nationwide, we predict about a 13% decline in abortions. And that's factoring in all those places where we have nothing happening. It's much bigger conditional on being in an affected region. It's about a third. But nationwide, it's about 13%. And we go and take the current, well, I've done this is not in our paper. For you, I took the current age-specific fertility rate. I added a very lightly shaded region that shows you what happens if I add all the abortions being reported in this country right now. And then I add a darkly shaded region. How much would this go up if 13% of those abortions were prevented and resulted in births? And the answer is, actually, this isn't a very big change. And this is an extreme circumstance in which I'm modeling every prevented legal abortion as resulting in a birth, which itself is quite unlikely. Other things might happen, like women might self-manage abortions, for instance. Pregnancy rates might change, for instance. So even under this very extreme scenario, the total fertility rate's modeled to increase from about 1.85. I'm using the most recent abortion data I've got, so this is 2013, from 1.85 to 1.90. And a more reasonable projection might be that about 30% of those abortions would result in births. So then we're talking about maybe like a 0.015 increase in the total fertility rate. So this hypothetical policy scenario could obviously matter a great deal to the 30,000 women a year who might be giving birth as a result. But in terms of thinking about big projections, abortion was a major factor in fertility changes in the early 70s, but I don't think it would be the opposite side of the same coin if we were to see a major change in abortion policy right now. Okay, thanks.
Around the mid-1960s, birth rates, total fertility rates had been a lot higher than 3.0 in earlier years. But if you condition that on survival to age 10, it's remarkable that sort of smoothing it out from 1875 all the way out to about 1965, the birth rates were at about 3. So the question is it a matter of desired number of births or desired number of ultimate surviving children that has been driving things? And what we've seen, of course, is the fundamental shift since then of going from 3 to 2 in terms of realization and presumably expectation, and that's been really like a big deal. One other thing I'd like to just sort of observe a little bit about the baby boom period. I'm probably one of the few on the call or in the room that have any recollection back to that period, having been born early in it and having heard from my parents. The baby boom obviously got going with all the exuberance after World War II. I can tell you with my parents, and they were obviously not unique, everybody was knocking out kids very quickly after World War II. During the war, it was kind of hard to have kids when you're not together, but it started happening right away when people were in their 20s and their early 30s, and they were really having a lot of kids. And to some extent, I think what happened when the baby boom period was ending, and we see it peaking around 1960, and then starting to drop after that. Well, to some extent, those people coming back from World War II, they'd had their 3 kids, and so that sort of surge that happened after World War II, you would expect to come down. I think Caitlin just mentioned Roe in 1973. That contributed to it, and I can also share with you that there was a period after the early 1960s in which this thing called Vietnam came along, and that had some effect on people's interest in having kids and their sort of outlook for the future. I suggest also that when we look through these periods, more than just the economics, one thing that really has a big effect on people desiring to have kids, get married, and all the rest of it, is just sort of what their peers are doing. There's an awful lot of that. And like I said, after World War II, everybody was having kids. During the Vietnam era, not nearly so much. And so, the question is, what do we go in the future? One other observation, too, about what happened after the baby boom period, I was just looking at some numbers last night, and this, we don't have a slide on this, but it would align a lot with what you've seen in the total fertility rate. If you look at the average wage for workers in the U.S. In 2019 CPI index dollars, if you look at that, that actually peaked in 1973, and then it began to decline after 1973, and it reached a low point in 1982. And in fact, it didn't get back up to the 1973 level on a real basis until 1997. So in terms of economic determinants, to the extent that earnings levels really matter, we see, in addition to Roe in 1973, we also saw that actual earnings levels, the average wage for all workers in the U.S., started dropping off in real terms after 1973. Bottomed in 1982, and then started coming back up very gradually. Didn't really start coming back up until about 1988 or 89, and that, of course, is the period in which we saw somewhat of a resurgence of total fertility rates coming back up. So we've paid a lot of attention, and we always do, to the cohort effects. The period effects really have a lot of influence on all of this too. So if I could, in just a very few minutes, flip to a couple of the slides. I don't know if you have them available that I'd sent in, and these really sort of add to and build on, I think, to some extent, and probably overlap with an awful lot of what's been presented already. But on slide number 2 that I had, this is just really a run through, nothing that needs to be mentioned too much because I think it's all been mentioned already. Karen already ran through fertility is probably the most critical parameter of all for the age of distribution of our population, which simply determines the number of elders and the number of working age, which determines almost everything economic for our society. Birth rates did drop after 1965, and a lot of reasons just mentioned for that. They returned to about a 2.0 level. This is the total fertility rate in 1990 to 2007, largely because of the effects of what everybody sort of described so far, but not use the sort of technical term tempo. We had a lot of change after 1965 of people at younger ages for many reasons starting to have fewer kids, but then as has been observed by many here, we started to have the birth rates at higher ages, especially in the 30s, going back up. Birth expectation surveys, Karen and others went through with some care. On slide number 3, I think I just recreate what you've seen from several people, a look at the age-specific or by age group birth rates for women. And in this case, it's since 1994. So let's sort of put the baby boom period and the baby bust past us. That's there. And what we're really a primary concern with is, I think everybody's well described, is where we are going forward, especially what's happened since 2000, where we saw at least sort of a slight decline starting for the 20 to 24, and of course a massive decline for the under 20. But then we had a turning point in 2007 where we started to have the reduction, obviously related at least to some degree in what was happening with the recession, employment, and earnings levels. And the bottom has really dropped off for 14 to 19. Not clear we should expect it to be coming back. 2024, interesting also. So the question really is, are we dealing with another tempo effect like we had going on to some extent back after the baby boom period? Everybody was a little bit surprised when in 1990 the total fertility rate came back up. Why? Because of the tempo. A lot of people in the 1980s were assuming that we would have forever much, much lower total fertility rates than 2.0, but lo and behold, tempo came around and made the difference. And the question is, will that be the case now? So on slide number 4, I just try to have fewer lines so that we'd actually have a better chance of looking at this. And I think the selection of age groups I'm looking at here is much of what Kasey did on some of her slides. But here I just looked at the 20 up to 34 age group. The 30 to 34 kind of representing really 30 and over. I mean, several have observed that we've been having increases in 30 to 34 all the way up to 40 to 44. And this sort of kind of represents that. In the period, as you can see, between 2000 and 2007, we can see that 30 to 34 and 25 to 9 were still rising nicely, and it's the 20 to 24 that was starting to sort of fall off. But then as the recession came, everybody but 30 to 34 and above 34 also started to drop off pretty precipitously. And of course, really the question is sort of why? So flipping to slide 5, there appears to be a significant effects from the economy and the earnings levels. We saw that certainly back in the 1970s and 80s when earnings levels were dropping. They're at least associated. They're obviously not the only driver, but obviously a contributor to what is happening here. And one of the questions I think we should really address, and I think we're going to look at it a little bit more closely, and I hope everybody else will, is when things change, like, for instance, economic opportunity, what is the lag between the effect of a change? It would appear as though the data suggests and logic suggests that when things turn negative in terms of economic opportunity, that might have a rather immediate effect, whereas when things turn more positive, it appears there might be a much more of a lagged effect. And I think one or two of the presenters so far have sort of suggested that it takes a while to catch up when the economy recovers. And even though to some extent the economy has been recovering, we have not seen enough of that, especially at the age groups where we would expect most fertility. On slide 6, I just wanted to put in here, and Martha sort of already really nailed this one about what's going on with marriage. We've recognized for a long time that marriage is, for better or for worse, not a prerequisite to having children. And we can see that going back to 1994, marriage prevalence all the way from 20 all the way up to 34 has really been declining pretty consistently, and yet it's only basically since the recession that we've had the big drops in the total fertility rate. And in fact, I would note that actually the total fertility rate didn't drop below 2.0 until 2010. So even the first couple years of the recession, birth rates were dropping somewhat, but we didn't actually pierce the 2.0 fertility rate and drop below that even until 2010. On slide number 7, tried to look a little bit at economic determinants. And again, I'm just trying to sort of focus on what Jim was describing this panel as being, economic determinants. So many other things to consider. I'm glad that Caitlin is the one who brought up sex and not me, and you know, the issues of abortion and all the rest, and many other considerations. But just looking at the economic determinants on slide number 7, this is looking for these 3 5-year age groups going from 20 up to 34. What happened since 1994 in terms of the employment rate? Now, all of you who got employment rates relative to 1.0 for 1994, just so you could see sort of what the trending was for each of these age groups. These are not absolute. And you can see that things were doing nicely up to 2000. There was some sort of pulling back in all 3 age groups between 2000 and 2006. But then the employment rates really dropped, obviously, in the recession down to lows around 2011 with really, really substantial effects. Now, we've had some pretty good responses back up for most of these groups, less for 20 to 24 than for women in the 30s. And the same is really basically true for men, although men have recovered less at all age groups even than women. If we flip to slide number 8, now getting into sort of earnings levels, average earnings levels. I mentioned just a little while ago that back in the 70s, even into the 80s, average earnings levels in real terms were not really doing very well. Well, here are real earnings kind of similar for males and females. We can see things were doing nicely up to 2000. Things were not rising all that much between 2000 and 2007. And for those who actually were employed after 2007, at least for quite a while, up to about 2013-14, real increases were really not very much at all, males even dropping more so. There's been some recovery since, but this really speaks, I would suggest, to the idea of even though the earnings levels in real terms have been coming back up in general, is there a lag effect between that and when people feel solid about the earnings levels that we're going to remain in good shape and therefore have the desire to go and start having family formation and having kids? Slide number 9 sort of speaks a little bit more to this. Slide number 9 shows the relative earnings levels for people in these 3 age groups compared to the overall earnings levels for people of their gender. Females on the left, males on the right. And you can see that females 20 to 24 relative to overall female average earnings levels dropped precipitously since 2000, and even more precipitously leading up to about 2012. So looking just at the average earnings levels overall, or overall even by gender, doesn't really tell the whole story. We've seen that in the 20s, women and men, their average earnings levels have really dropped relative to the overall earnings levels for people of their sex. And certainly that probably has some effect, since it is at these age levels, as everybody's pointed already, that we're seeing the sort of, the negative effects on the birth rates that we've had of late. Now, looking at slide number 10, I tried to sort of combine here the effects of the relative employment rate effect and also the change in the relative earnings levels. And you can see this actually looks a lot like the other 2 slides, somewhat of a drop-off, especially for 20 to 24 in 2000, 2007, but precipitous to the bottom of the recession. Now, several have observed that, well, wait, things look like they're coming back up to some extent after about 2010, 11, 12, and so where's the response in terms of total fertility rates on this, and impact in particular for fertility rates for people at these ages? I would suggest here that, again, when things turn bad, people tend to react kind of quickly to them. If you decide to have a child, dare I say, well, that's that. You're stuck. The kid's there. You can easily, when things turn bad, decide, well, I'll wait, I'll defer. And it looks like there's perhaps a lot of that going on. That is really left to be the question for the future. One of the other aspects that really is probably worth mentioning is clearly there's been much discussion about millennials have accumulated a lot of debt. Now, part of the persistence of that debt may be because the availability of jobs and the availability of good-paying jobs has not been as good for them in their 20s as has been true for some of the rest of the population and for some prior generations. So it's not just that they've accumulated some student debt, but also having a hard time paying it off with the jobs not being as good. Will this change? Will the trends up in employment and the trends up in relative earnings levels for people in their 20s continue up, allowing things to be better for these groups? And even if not, will we continue to see, as the birth expectation survey suggests, some turn back up by having the women in their 30s? I think several people said there's plenty of time left for women in their 30s, obviously, to still have children. And will the economic outlook be such that we would expect that to be occurring? On my last little slide here, number 12, you can see what we have for the latest 2019 trustees report been projecting for the birth rates for these three particular age groups, going from 20 up to 35. And you can see we're not really assuming there will be any significant increase in 20 to 24, that many of the effects discussed so far will probably persist toward a new lower level for them. The question is for 25 to 9 and 30 to 34, will the 25 to 9 reverse? Will partly from what we call a tempo effect? The drop in the birth rates that we've experienced to such a great extent for women under 25, will they now, with better economic outlook in the future, start to move back up? And will the tempo effect for the 30 to 34s, as it did back after the baby boom period, will that start to come back up? Similar for 35 and older. And the one little dashed line I put on here is sort of interesting. This looks at the 20 to 34 as a composite. And obviously, even in the period where things were dropping between 2007 and 2017, that didn't drop as much because the 30 to 34s were sort of helping even during that period relative to the big drop for 20 to 24. The question is, will we, for that primary age group, 20 to 34, which is where about 3 and 4 votes actually occur, will we come back to anything like the levels for those age groups that we have seen in the past as recently as 2000, even 2007 or 8, prior to the big effects of the recession? Huge questions. Jim, thank you so much for setting up this panel and for letting me grab a few minutes here at the end and the opportunity to hear all the other wonderful presentations. We will benefit from this greatly and appreciate it, and I hope you all will enjoy a wonderful lunch.